Tonight, we have a program by Charles Goldblum, and he is right here, and he will introduce himself. If you have questions, ask as we go.
You'll be able to.
Good evening. My name is Charles Goldblum. I am a physicist in my day job with the Johns Hopkins University Applied Physics Laboratory. And for the past year or so, I've been really doing a lot of photography, particularly Milky Way photography and nightscape photography. So tonight, I'm going to talk to you about a little bit about the Milky Way. The problem of inviting a physicist to a camera club, I have to talk about the physics part. What is the Milky Way? Where is it? I'll talk to you a bit about taking photos of the Milky Way, which is something that you could only do with relatively recent technology. You really couldn't do it 20 years ago. The sensors didn't have the noise floor, or in other words, a high enough ISO to capture the light from the Milky Way without using telescopes or other extraordinary means. And I'm going to complete tonight talking about editing Milky Way photos. Now, the edits I ultimately do use Lightroom, then Photoshop. Actually, I use Adobe Camera Raw, then Photoshop. But tonight I'm going to walk through some of the edits I do in Lightroom to give you a sense of when you have this very dim raw picture, how do we recover the sky? And most importantly, what are realistic colors? So let's go on.
I'll be there.
Actually, let me ask you to go back. I want to make one point. I'm sorry. This is Milky Way season. So Milky Way season in the Northern Hemisphere is between March and early November. And then you can't see the galactic core. You can still see the Milky Way, but not the galactic core. Early in the season, the Milky Way is this beautiful arch. As you get to mid-season, David and I were out near Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge. The Milky Way is about a 45-degree angle. And late in the season, it will be vertical. And if someone really wants to know how we know all this, and how, I'll talk to you later, but this is, to me, I've always wanted to capture one of these in Pano. I might have the opportunity in a couple of weeks. I'll be north of Phoenix. But I just wanted to point out the shape of the Milky Way. Let's go on. Thanks. So what is the Milky Way? Next. The Milky Way is basically everything we see. Now, these are extraordinary images of the globular clusters, the pillars of creation. You've seen some of these photos, and this is the Orion Nebula, which we'll step into. These are all components of the Milky Way. We look at Milky Way, we see sort of this orange core and a bunch of stars, but everything is there. What's great now is that the Webb Space Telescope and also some Hubble telescopes, a lot of these images are made available to you free of charge. They're just download high-resolution images. What's interesting from a scientific point of view, the Webb Space Telescope is not an optical telescope. It works in the near infrared, which means someone needs to make a calculation from that which we cannot see to these gorgeous images. Next. Also in the Milky Way, you can see the evidence of a black hole. This is something called an Einstein ring. I'm just pointing this out because you invited a physicist to give you a talk. This is what happens. The black hole you can't see directly. However, you can see the effects on nearby stars, and this is a great example of them. The curvature here infers the existence of this huge gravitational pull. Next, we'll get to photography, I promise. And of course, since we're close to Annapolis, I have to show you a picture of the Crab Nebula, very famous, as well as the Ring Nebula. These are gorgeous structures. You're not going to see these even with the best commercial cameras, but you can certainly get them with telescopes, or these are space telescopes. The question is, where are we? We're here. This is the galactic core. The Milky Way is a spiral structure, and we're pretty close to the center of this spiral rather. Given its size, this is 100,000 light years. So if you recall from school, light year is the time it takes light to travel. This is a huge, monstrous thing, and we're sort of in the middle of it. And because of our position, that's why we can only see it visible during half the year. And the second half of the year, you can see it in the southern hemisphere.
So just to clarify, the Milky Way that we think of as like the milky stream in the sky is the galactic core of the.
That's part of it, yes. The galactic core is the most visible thing.
I mean, make sure if they don't have a microphone that you repeat.
Sure. So the question was, what is that we see? And we'll see. The question is, what do we see and what do we associate the Milky Way with? And we typically associate the Milky Way with the galactic core. Next. And this is my last science slide, then I'll go on. Question is, what is in the galactic core? So in a very recent measurement, 2022, the Event Horizon Telescope came up with Sagittarius A star, which is the hardest evidence yet of the existence of an Einstein black hole. Now we'll go to a little photography. Next. When you piece all this together, when you do appropriate planning, you're able to capture an image of the Milky Way. This is an image I took from a wonderful place called Craters of the Moon National Monument. It's about an hour and a half north of Idaho Falls, near a very small town called Arco. It's a national monument. This is in an area called the Devil's Orchard. And later when I talk about editing, I'll tell you, this was also a blue hour image blended with this, but I made a really bad mistake and I included these shrubberies. And after spending probably about 10 hours trying to isolate the shrubs from the blue hour image, from the dark sky image, we just left them dark, but we'll go more into this. Next. Now I'll talk about photographing the Milky Way. David's here, we were out here last July 4th, I think it was the 3rd to the 4th, near the Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge, and we're able to use a little bit of light painting to capture this abandoned structure with the Milky Way rising behind it, and this is around 1 or 1:30 in the morning. I think I left before him, I got pretty tired, but we'll talk more about how do you do it. So, this is your enemy when you're photographing the Milky Way, the moon. I mean, the harvest moon was fun to photograph. I even caught, this is a flight from Tampa Bay to Boston, a JetBlue flight. We caught crossing it. It's just a cool photo. But we always plan to do our Milky Way shoots when the sun is, the moon is at its smallest portion, because the moon is the brightest thing in the sky. And there are some very beautiful shots with a small crescent moon, but when you have a full moon, this overwhelms the sensor and you can't capture that which is in the sky. But over today, in this little talk, I'm going to talk about the equipment I use. I brought some examples. Feel free to interrupt me, by the way. I'm very interruptible. I'll talk about planning. How do we know at the simplest level when it's a new moon? But most importantly, how can we use applications on our phones to anticipate not just where to find the Milky Way, but exactly at what angle, azimuth, and at what elevation it's coming up, and what time of day. And that can help you, if you use these tools correctly, to even plan to get a really impressive foreground. When we're taking that picture near Cambridge, that was opportunistic. We drove out to a very dark road. There were a couple structures my fellow travelers knew. We took advantage of those structures. But if you really want to capture some stunning images, planning really makes a difference. I'm going to talk a little bit about camera settings. I use a full frame Sony. I brought it here just to go through a couple things with it. The settings vary on the type of Milky Way photo you're taking, and I'll go through the different types. Single shot, panos, multiple shots, and finally I'll talk a little bit about tracking and how we do that. And finally, I'll give you at least my recommended resources. There are other folks in the club who are very experienced Milky Way and nightscape photographers, and she's very welcome to add in anything I miss, of course. Next, camera. So you don't need a full frame camera to capture the Milky Way, but you need a relatively recent modern camera. And the thing that makes it most easy is having a high enough ISO. So the actual capture of the Milky Way, you would never do at 128,000. There's too much noise. And we can talk about digital noise, the types of noise. There's too much noise. However, when you're focusing your camera, it's very beneficial to start at 128,000 ISO. Some older cameras, my wife who is here has a Nikon D90, probably a 20-year-old camera. It's a fine camera, but it doesn't have the dynamic range. There's not much light out in the Milky Way. So you need everything to your advantage. You need a wide open, well, I'll go into the details about the lens. You need relatively fast glass with a very low aperture, wide open aperture. You need to have this much dynamic range in ISO, and a couple other things. The next thing you need is a remote trigger. So with single shot images, your shutter speed is typically anywhere between 15 and 30 seconds. And that depends on your focal length. It depends on a lot of factors, your aperture, but it's open a while. If you simply press your camera as it's sitting on your tripod, it induces enough vibration, it will affect it. So you have basically two choices. One, you use the 2-second delay in your camera. That works great. But a better choice in most cases is using a remote trigger, either Bluetooth or intervalometer. If you're doing multiple shots, if I'm going to do 20 frames or 30 frames, then move those images together is much easier using an intervalometer. I'm a Sony shooter, but the Sony intervalometer is incredibly overpriced and is less capable. I'm not even sure what brand this is. This is a $30 Velo intervalometer. I'm going to tell you a story about what not to do with this. So,
Yeah.
don't try to figure it out at 1 o'clock in the morning when you're trying to shoot the Milky Way. Because I did that the first night I used that. And I sat there with a YouTube video and this and going back and forth and trying to make it work, and it drove me nuts. These things work great. There's a silly learning curve with them. And once you do it, it works out. Lenses. You really want f2.8 or faster. And f2.8 is fine. When you start with an f4, it makes it much more difficult. I think you can do it, but f2.8 is better. You do not need a particularly expensive lens. This is a $350, maybe $400 Rokinon lens, manual focus. You don't need automatic focus. You actually don't want automatic focus. This is a 14 millimeter f2.8 lens. It works great. There are other lenses you can get, much more expensive. This is great. When you start out, and this is for a single shot Milky Way, 14 to 28 millimeters. If you're doing panos, or you're doing multiple shots, or you get a lot of experience, or you're doing tracking, you can use multiple focal lengths. I think Cheryl was telling me, would you go up to 150 or even higher?
Yeah, for tracking deep.
Well, track, and I'll talk about tracking a bit. You can go high. But the first time you go shoot the Milky Way, first of all, I recommend you go someone who's done it before, because it's a little less confusing and intimidating. And you start with a wide angle lens. And it is workable to 50 millimeter. Tripod. It's incredibly important that it's sturdy. I brought this down a little bit so I can use it. It goes higher. This is a Benro tripod. And there are a couple things I want to show you about it. This sling here is important. So you can either hang your camera bag by this hook, or in this case, you can fill with rocks. I usually use my big backup battery. You want some weight here. This is a very inexpensive thing, but you want extra stability, especially when it's even a little bit windy. The second thing, life is so much easier if you're not using a ball head. This is a 3-axis head that allows you to tilt, rotate, or change the elevation of your camera. Because when you finally dial it in, you're getting close. You'll use your app. I use PhotoPills. There are some other apps you can use for planning. It's much, much easier, especially if you're trying to use an illuminated foreground. you dial this in to your foreground and you watch versus trying to move a ball head. One of the biggest things I learned, I took a class, an online class, really extensive one to learn how to do this. And I practice and practice and practice. But one of the best advice she gave is to practice with your camera at home when it's dark. Either you're really familiar with your camera, you've used it for years and years and years, but literally sitting in your living room with your camera, trying to change the settings, trying to, focus on the furthest star, change your focal length, and sort of drill in. Learn how to do that sort of with your finger function in the dark of your house. Because when you're outside and you're anxious and other people are moving around, it is so much easier. Next, planning. Well, the first thing I mentioned is the moon cycle. That's the biggest thing. You want to shoot around the new moon. It doesn't need to be that day, but I usually go 3 days before, 3 days after. Once again, the moon is the brightest object, aside from the sun, in the sky. The next thing is the Bortle scale. The Bortle scale is a scale I'll go into a little more detail between 1 and 9. 9 is Las Vegas, New York City. 1, there are a few places around the United States and around the world that are truly the darkest skies we have. One of them, the Bortle 1 to 2, was that picture from Craters of the Moon National Monument. The best, well, I guess if you go to Cherry Point, is that the name of the park in northern Pennsylvania? Starry Springs, thank you. I couldn't remember. Cherry Springs is probably a Bortle 2 because they do these measurements. When you go to the eastern shore, Assateague, on a good night, it's probably a Bortle 2. Some of the areas near Cambridge and where I was this past weekend, I was at Janes Island State Park, Bortle 3. And you can get wonderful pictures in the Bortle 3. You get interesting pictures in the higher skies too. But the Bortle scale is what determines the darkness. Weather. Shooting the Milky Way out west is a lot easier. They don't have as many clouds as we do here. This past weekend, my wife Beth and I and some friends, I went to teach a Milky Way photography course to help the Janes Island State Park gain their night sky certification from the International Night Sky Society. One of the qualifying factors to get the certification, beside the measurements and the way they treat their street lights and everything else, was having an educational component. So I volunteered, I went, we taught. The plan was on Saturday to do a lecture from 6:30 to 8, then go out with a pontoon boat to this really beautiful beach at 2 o'clock in the morning with a group of people who signed up to shoot the Milky Way. And that all failed because it was really, really cloudy on Saturday night. And that's what occurs. So when you're doing the Milky Way here, and a lot of folks do, you don't really start driving to where you're going until you're tracking the weather or tracking cloud cover. I use an app, which I'll get to, which gives you a lot more details, not just about cloud cover, but about the clarity. So weather, out west, I wasn't done in by weather, but I was done in by something else. I showed you one picture. That was my first night at Craters of the Moon National Monument. I was okay with it, and I wanted to do things different the next night, so I worked a whole day. I was working at Idaho National Labs, which is nearby. I went back to my Airbnb. I slept a few hours, and I was about to go back out. Then I realized that the smoke from a wildfire in Stanley, Idaho, had crept all the way across the state of Idaho, was blocking the sky. I called a ranger in the National Monument, and she was kind enough to go outside and said, yeah, you're not going to see anything tonight. So it's not just the weather, it's anything that might stop skies. Locating the Milky Way. I assume some of you here have come across photopills before? If not, I have an example of it up there. Photopills is a wonderful app to plan not just Milky Way photography, but any photography. The word pills are little applications within the app that allow you to do field of view, depth of field. It does all sorts of calculations. PhotoPills is like a $12 app, but there's a learning curve. And you might say, well, it's easy to learn. I'll go to the YouTube site that has PhotoPills. And there is the man who created PhotoPills. He's a great guy. I've had meals with him, and I can't understand a word he says. I heard him give a lecture this last September at a conference focused on nighttime photography in Kanab, Utah, and I still can't understand him. He's from the island of Mallorca, and his accent is, at least for me and for many others. There's a YouTube channel that has something called PhotoPills Friday. It's a photographer based in Vermont. She teaches this app with incredible clarity, and I highly recommend looking up PhotoPills Friday if you're really interested in learning this app. It itself is non-intuitive, but that's just a recommendation. And finally, safety. I highly recommend not going to a site for the first time at night.
Ow.
When Beth and I went out to Janes Island Park, we got there on a Thursday, took a couple days off. I went out with the park ranger on the pontoon boat to the beach where we were planning to shoot. When we got there, we pulled up to a beautiful dock. It was a little bit of a boat ride. Great. We get on the dock and we start walking down the dock, crossing over a boardwalk to the beach on the other side. And the boardwalk itself was fine until it wasn't. So you would have boards, then you would have nothing, then you had to sort of walk on a 2x4 for a few feet. Then you have more boards, then you had to climb on things. I think it would have been doable at night, but having been there during the day made it gave me a sense of what it would take, especially when we have, things are moving.
Went back to the start for some reason.
Especially when you have other people with you and you need to know what to light up. Another example, David, who came by here tonight, he and I went out to shoot the Milky Way in Cambridge, a picture at Cambridge, Maryland, July 4th. And when we met out there, David was wearing a safety vest, right like I work on the road safety vest. I was like, oh, that's odd. At least I found him, I saw him, and we're working a while. And I finally was curious, why are you wearing the safety vest, I asked. And about 15 minutes later, after the bars were closing in Cambridge, a couple of pickup trucks came full speed down this road. And we were grabbing our tripods, getting out of the way. It's like, I think the next day I bought the safety vest from Amazon. You know, safety is important. Safety at night is important. Not walking off the cliff or hurting yourself is really important. So that's the moon cycle. So this is the ideal phase of the moon is a new moon. Goes without saying. Next.
Now, Charles, why is that? Why is that better than, the
Waning or waxing?
the red moon?
Well, it's not really the red moon. It's the amount of light. So what happens is the moon's the brightest thing in the sky. And when you have a larger surface that's illuminated by the sun, it basically makes it more difficult to pick up the photons from the Milky Way itself, from the light from the Milky Way. It dominates your sensor.
Elmer, thank you.
As I mentioned, the Bortle scale. There are very few, there are big parts of Oregon now that are designated Bortle 1. There are parts of Utah, dark sky. Idaho has some Bortle 1 sites. The West Coast, there are many more. On the East Coast, I forgot the name of the park, Cherry Springs, which is in northern Pennsylvania, Bortle 1, Bortle 2. Beth and I are going out to Watauga State Park in West Virginia in June during a new moon. That's a Bortle 2 sky. There's some places you have to do a little research. There are all sorts of apps that will give you, most of them are free, basically allow you to look and find a location that's relatively dark sky. Here on the East Coast where we live, the best places to go either to West Virginia, going to Pennsylvania, it's really at the northern part of Pennsylvania, it's quite a long drive, but the Eastern Shore, when you get sort of near Cambridge, Maryland, go into that area, you start getting dark enough skies, you can get some beautiful images.
Good.
I mentioned briefly the dark sky, formerly the International Dark Sky Society. This is a great organization to donate to be a part of, that sort of supports dark skies. There are dark sky cities in the United States. Sedona, Arizona is one of them, where they've changed all their street lighting to have minimum impact on the night sky. The same way a moon will reflect back a lot of the light pollution itself will overwhelm your sensor. You will not be able to photograph the sky you want. Next. Weather. This is the app I use, Astrospheric. It's a paid app. I'm not sure how much I paid, less than $20, I'm sure. And it tells you exactly not just the cloud cover, but the visibility. It's a wonderful app. Highly recommend it. This is the one, especially if you're about to drive 2 hours in the car each way. This is the one I absolutely believe. AccuWeather and the others are fine. This is the one I absolutely believe. When you're on your computer, windy.com and clearoutside.com give you that same data. Windy.com, I think, might be a subscription. Clearoutside.com is free. It just gives you the data and serves you up a bunch of ads, of course. But these are the ones I trust for doing planning, especially if you're going to travel some distance. Next. Time of day. So when we're looking at the Milky Way, there's no like, oh, the sun sets here, therefore it's dark. You have, and we all know this as being photographers, you have golden hour, it's beautiful. Then you have blue hour. When you talk about night photography, they break it up a little differently. You have civil twilight, nautical, astronomical, and night. And even though the sun has gone below the horizon, it's still illuminating other particles in the sky that create some beautiful photography. This is really quite nice to shoot blue hour, photographs. But in terms of having perfect visibility, you need to wait till astronomical night. One of the ways to figure it out, and the best way, is this app, PhotoPills. PhotoPills has many, many screens. I simply took a screenshot here of the planner function. But if you pull up PhotoPills on your phone, I highly recommend it, it tells me exactly, if I look at my home screen, of course it's not telling me, right. In my home screen over here, it tells me exactly when golden hour is, blue hour, and astronomical. And it tells you the same thing in reverse the next day, when it begins to get light. This is the most reliable way to figure out if you have enough darkness to capture the sky. The planner itself, so this is James Island State Park, where we were last Saturday. This is the beach we planned to shoot from. So I was able to drop a pin here, and based on the time of night, I could figure out exactly where the galactic core, where the Milky Way was. PhotoPills also has a augmented reality component, which will be absolutely impossible to see on, But basically, you can't quite see it, and certainly people can't, but it allows you to figure out where the Milky Way is in the sky. So as you're setting it up, you can look at this and say, yep, it's in this direction. So here, the galactic core is not quite up yet, but it tells you exactly where it is. Highly recommend it. There are other things I'll talk to you about. Next. Technique. There are many ways to capture the Milky Way, and I rank these from the easiest to advanced. And when you're learning how to do this and when you're practicing, I recommend starting with single exposure. Single exposure means I'm going to take one shot, I'm going to figure out how long the shutter's going to be open based on my focal length and my aperture, and that's going to be it. And it's going to be perfect, and we're going to put it in Lightroom. Now, of course, you don't take a single shot. You take many. Things go wrong. Your light on your head is still on. I'll talk about that a little bit. Or someone else is with their flashlight, or cars coming down the road. But a single shot when you're learning is the best place to do it. And I'll go into details like how long is too long for an aperture, And there are very specific ways to calculate this and to also see it. The next best way to do it is stacked. I love doing stacked. When you're doing a stacked Milky Way, and this is where my intervalometer comes in, you would likely take, let's say, 25 shots in a row. So let's say I'm doing 20 seconds. It'll be open 20 seconds, close for 1 second. Open 20, close for 1. You repeat that 20 times. Then you do something that sounds counterintuitive. You take your lens cap, which is no longer in my eyesight here, you put it on your camera, and you do 10 more shots, also for 20 seconds. Those are called dark frames. Without the lens cap, they're light frames. And you might say, why are you taking 10 shots in a row with your lens cap on? That's crazy. The reason is when you have under the same temperature, the same thermal conditions, and you put your lens cap on your lens, what you're able to do is understand exactly what the baseline noise is in your sensor. And then when you process your image using third-party software, or if you're really, I won't even try to do this in Photoshop, if you're doing third-party software, you take, they're called the dark frames. Let's say I have 10 of them. I take my 20 light frames, then I put that in software. For Macs, there's a wonderful program called Starry Landscape Stacker. It allows you to take in the images, and it does, and if I have 20 images, the Earth has rotated significantly in that time. If I left my lens open the entire duration of those 20 images, so 20 times 20 seconds, you would see star trails, right? Because the Earth is rotating. What Starry Landscape Stacker does two important things. It corrects for the rotation of the Earth, which theoretically one could do in Photoshop, but you would lose your mind doing it very quickly. And it also, looking at the dark images, the dark frames, it calculates and removes the intrinsic noise in your sensor. And together you get crisp photos, and this is without tracking. Starry Landscape Stacker is a Mac-only application. The version for PC is called Sequitur. I'm a Mac user, so I haven't used Sequitur. This is relatively easy to use, and it's relatively inexpensive, about $30. The next level of Milky Way shooting is panos. I use a pano rig. You can use something like this. Find a pano rig, especially one where you can do the clicks in each direction, works well. One of the challenges, though, is stitching the images together. So if we were taking a simple pano of a landscape or of a room, take a photo, overlap a third, then I can put it actually in Lightroom and say, these are a pano, and Lightroom will stack them together. You could do the same thing in Photoshop. The hard part comes in, and the reason that works with Lightroom and Photoshop, I have objects, I have things that are absolutely referenced here. When you start, especially when you're doing vertical panos of the Milky Way, it's very difficult to recognize the common points where the overlaps occur. Basically, Lightroom and Photoshop become overwhelmed with stars. If you're simply trying to contain the foreground, it works quite well. As you start going vertically, it doesn't work great. The recommended software for doing this is actually PT GUI. Capital P, capital T, capital G, lowercase ui. That allows you to stack images together. I do the same thing. I do some volunteer work with my drone going over historical Goshen farm. I was asked to create a map of the farm. It's 22 acres. When I'm over the farm property with my drone, it's easy to capture the images. I can do it in Lightroom. When I'm in the woods and I'm trying to find trails and all the trees and all the trails look the same, standard procedures in Lightroom and Photoshop just don't cut it, and I use PT GUI for that. And finally, the best way to get the crispest photos is tracked. So remember, the limitation, the thing that says I can open my lens for 20 seconds or less, is you're trying to avoid star trails, and I'll tell you how we do those calculations.
What?
One way to avoid star trails is to put it on a mount that basically rotates counter to the rotation of the Earth. To make this work, the actual axis of the motor, and I didn't bring mine here. I'm glad I got all this other stuff. The axis of the motor needs to be pointed toward Polaris. And what I do is I use my phone. I use a program, we just had it out, called PS Align Pro. And this is sort of the nighttime version. I put a rubber band here, because basically the alignment's along the axis of the phone. So to get close, I put the rubber band, I put this here, and I find Polaris. In this case, Polaris is there. That's the right elevation, the right azimuth. And that's a starting point when you mount your motor axis. And I'll leave this out here. And this is just a piece of wood, a rubber band, and something that fits into my mount, my track head. And then you use this to get set. You put your motor on that axis. And remember, the Milky Way is not that direction. Milky Way is going to be over here. And you have a rig to allow the camera to figure out where the Milky Way is using photopills. This rotates then, your entire system rotates as the Earth, counter to the Earth rotation, so the stars stay still. And suddenly you can go from 20-second exposures to 20-minute exposures, depending on the quality of your alignment. What? Yes?
How does it track Polaris?
You aim the motor rotation, aim the motor of the tracker, you dial it in with a scope more than this app. This app gets you the first direction, and it basically rotates the way the Earth rotates. As long as the motor axis is pointing to Polaris, and the motor is rotating at the same rotational velocity of the Earth, the stars will stay still.
So it just automatically knows what the rotational velocity is. It doesn't actually track Polaris.
That is true. Yes, I should be clear. The question is, does it know the rotational? No, the motor is set. There are usually two switches. I'm in the northern hemisphere, or switch the direction, I'm in the southern hemisphere. And it's a fixed motor. People have had mixed experience. I use a relatively inexpensive one, and it tracks the rotation of the Earth. And now your aperture can stay open, your shutter can stay open for minutes on end. And as long as you're tracking correctly, you won't have star trails.
Charles?
Yes.
When you do that thing with the stick, do you still need to go in and fine tune it with the scope?
Yes, you do. There's in PS, in my, I keep forgetting the name, in this app, Polar Scope Align Pro, by going in daytime mode, that just gives you a starting point. Now, a lot of people, if it's a clear night, because they Polaris it that way. But if you ever, especially when you scope out the site during the daytime, it's good to know which way you're going.
Nice.
Sure. Next. Star trails are wonderful, except when you're trying to do the Milky Way. I love taking star trail photos. Star trail photos, you might have your aperture open, your shutter open for hours. Usually you do it about 30 minutes at a time or 20 minutes at a time. As I mentioned, last September, I was in a nightscaper conference in Kanab, Utah, and the founder of the conference, and his name is escaping me right now, gave a wonderful lecture on star trails. And he also pointed out that you can do this with film also. And he recommended which film he was using, a twin lens reflex camera with a certain type of color film. The challenge there is you have to open the aperture and make sure no one interferes with your camera for the following 8 hours, which is pretty cool. I have not tried it, but star trails are wonderful, except when you're trying to shoot the Milky Way, right? We're trying to avoid this rotation, and that's why we choose shutter speeds that give you enough light to get in, but when you don't have these streaks.
Got it.
Next. Basic camera settings, which I'll get to in a second before we go to it. A couple other things I have up here.
Yeah.
The other thing that will get you is moisture on your lens. One of the ways to prevent that is a very inexpensive lens heater. The way you'll know you'll get in trouble with moisture in your lens is to track the dew point. When you hit the dew point, that's when moisture starts to accumulate. And then it's a hard battle to wipe your lens. It keeps accumulating. This is just a very simple heater. As I mentioned before, I keep my extra battery here in my sling for a counterweight. You plug it in, it keeps your lens warm. Other things, especially when you go out with a group of people, this tape is reflective gaffer's tape. I have a roll here, if you can see the brand. It helps a lot. But the neatest trick I found are glow sticks. Looks like I broke one of my glow sticks already. What you do with the glow sticks is you put them in circles around the base of your tripod. And that keeps other people from walking into your tripod without interfering with the image you're trying to collect. Other important things, especially going out west, hand warmers. I have them in my bag. And lights. So Cheryl and I were talking a little bit with Christine about lights. So everyone says, well, and they're correct in this, when you're using red light, and I'm going to mess this up between the cones and the rods because I keep getting them backwards. But basically, your eyes need time to adapt to the dark, about 20 minutes. It takes less time if you have red light. However, when you're out shooting, especially if you're with someone else beside you, red light really interferes with the other people trying to take the shots. So what I do is I typically go out with a very bright light. And when I go out on the trail, mainly so I don't kill myself, so I use this very bright light bar, which I'm not going to point at anyone. It's quite bright. When I'm actually shooting, of course I can't figure out how to turn it off. We'll put it there for the time being. If I need to adjust my camera, my wife got these for me a few years ago. It's a very tiny LED, if you can see on my fingertips. And you notice it's white, it's not red. That if I need to see something and I can't figure it out with my fingers, it's dark at night, it's just a tiny enough light to make your adjustments without affecting your own eyes or any of your eyes of the folks with you. So this stuff's up here for you to look at. This is a very inexpensive little thing that allows you to do it. So let's talk about basic camera settings. Let's see if I can turn this off. Okay, there we go. You need to work in manual mode. When you do the initial focus, you might assume, well, of course, I'll just set it to infinity focus, it's there. It's not quite there. Usually, depending on your lens, which lens you're using, at least with my Rokinon, which I like very much, you have to adjust it. And how do you do that? I think I might do it on the next one. But that's where you set it, the focus to the ISO, the highest ISO you can get. My Sony a7R5, it's 128,000. And you find a star, you focus, then you use your camera. You don't have to take the photo with the Sonys. Other cameras, you have to take the photos. You zoom in, and you look and see how sharp that is. Since I'm not taking the photo, I tweak very gently the focus ring until that star is minimized. So I'm at 128,000. If I took the photo, it would be full of noise, it would be unusable. But in terms of adjusting it, that's the best way you do it. After you get that focus, you have two choices. In my Rokinon, I have a lock-unlock switch, which is really great. Let's say your camera doesn't have such a switch. Take a piece of gaffer's tape, not this stuff. This stuff's expensive. Plain gaffer's tape, which I keep in my camera bag. And once your focus locked in, you just put a piece of tape there so you can't move the focus ring. Now you're focused. You obviously set it to RAW. You will need all the dynamic range. JPEGs, I've never tried it, but with most things when you use JPEGs, you've lost information and you need every piece of information you can to recover a Milky Way photo. You set it to the widest aperture. In certain lenses, I use the lens, I forgot what it was. I was at a conference. When you go to these conferences, they'll always lend you gear. You know, you give them your driver's license. You know, they want you to have a taste of the gear in case you turn back and buy the $1,800 lens. In that case, it was like a 1.4. I backed it off a little to avoid something called comma. It's a little more esoteric. But you basically, in general, want to go to the lowest aperture setting, the most wide open aperture as possible to get the most light in. Shutter speed. We're typically between 10 and 25 seconds. Now, I'll talk coming up about how we determine what our starting point should be. Depending on your aperture, the actual ISO to take the photos, you're between 1600 and 6400. Obviously, the closer you are to 6400, you might have a challenge to remove some noise from the photo. But with these cameras, especially the Sonys, not so much. Next one's very important. Never use auto white balance. It will drive you nuts out there. I usually start with a lower, about 4600 Kelvin. The nice thing about shooting in RAW, I went to shoot the Milky Way, then my family and I went to Iceland last December for photography and tourism. I forgot to reset my white balance. I got some weird looking photos. You know, things are really, really blue. I was able to correct it, of course, after the fact. I was looking at the photos that first came out as like, sure, everything's cold to cover snow, but it's not that color blue. So when you set it for this, for Milky Way, just remember to turn it back. But if you're in RAW, doesn't make a difference. Two other important things. Turn off the long exposure noise stabilization in your camera. And if your lens is independently stabilized, turn that off also. Next. One of the questions is, how do you determine the maximum shutter speed? So remember, the reason we need to know this, if the shutter's open too long, you'll get star trails. If it's open too short, you're not gonna get enough light on your sensor to get a picture. There are two rules of thumb. One is the 500 rule, 500 divided by your focal length. You can calculate in your head most of the time because your focal length is usually fixed. It's easy. However, it sort of underestimates and gives you longer star trails than most of us would like. I recommend the MPF rule. In the MPF rule, and this is where you need either to pre-calculate it at home with your computer or use the PhotoPills app, it accounts for your focal length, aperture, sensor size, crop, full frame, etc. Resolution, I'll go into this, and the declination of the stars. In PhotoPills, it looks something like this. So for my Sony a7R5 on my 14mm lens, f2.8, at 30 degrees, and I want some accurate, if I follow the 500 rule, it says be open for 35 seconds. If I want really sharp stars, it says under the MPF rule, 8.3 seconds. And this is where something really funny comes in. The A7R5 is a wonderful camera with 61 megapixel. You guys switch to this also. Stupid number of megapixels. You don't need that many. And actually, it works against you when you're photographing the Milky Way. So when I'm doing nighttime photography with my camera, I turn it, you can adjust it in the Sony, and I bring it down to about 22 to 24 megapixel. Because what happens when you're going at the full density, when you're not averaging over 4 pixels, as what will happen, you basically are picking up, you're such high resolution, you're picking up star trails you don't want. So by lowering the resolution, and 24 megapixels is probably ideal, and that's why you don't need something with this sort of photo density to capture it. It allows you to get clearer photos without star trails by averaging over 4 pixels. Just a weird phenomenon. Next. So this is the actual procedure itself. You start with the camera, the highest ISO. You locate the Milky Way, and then the desired foreground. There are a couple ways to shoot the foreground. In the picture I showed you from Cambridge, Maryland, we did illumination, a little bit of light painting on the foreground. And the one I showed with the house, the abandoned house, there were probably, 45 of those taken. We'd have too much light, too little light. You didn't move the light enough. But the most important thing is if I'm trying to illuminate, what am I going to illuminate? If I want to illuminate this screen, for instance, what you don't want to do is illuminate it head on where you are with the camera. You want to illuminate it at an angle. So if the camera is facing the screen, I want to illuminate it at this angle, a raking angle. Otherwise, you'll have a very flat image. That will give you the dimensions of your image. The second thing you want to do is move the camera quickly and move the light, not the camera, the flashlight quickly by scanning quickly over it. And you just have to practice, because when David and I were out there, and we had another fellow with us, Kevin, it took lots of practice. It turns out Kevin seemed to be the best at it. He had the touch where you light it up real quick, and even though your shutter's open for 20 seconds, you might be light painting for 3 of those 20, because your technical word is integrating, but you're just adding up all the light that gets to your sensor. So you don't have to, if you try to illuminate for the whole 20 seconds, everything will be washed out. This takes practice, but keep in mind, it's usually quick, 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 and then you sit there for the remaining 17 seconds. It's open to give you a sense. Here, start in the case by using my PhotoPills app, single exposure, so my shutter speed between 15 and 30 seconds, f2.8 ISO. And you start somewhere, you keep a note, or you have a good memory, and you check your histogram, which we'll get to. You don't want to be clipped on either side, but most importantly in Milky Way photography, you want some content that will go across the spectrum. We'll look at some examples. You do this, look at your photo, repeat, repeat, repeat. And when you shoot, you want to confirm that your stabilization is off, and you want to, as I mentioned earlier, use a remote release or an intervalometer, or in worst case, a 2-second timer. You just don't want it to go off when you hit the camera. Next. We all know histograms, or most of us who've been doing photography for a while. You want to make sure, and this is the woman I will learn this from, Christine Richer, wonderful educator. Christine Rose Photography, she's Nova Scotia based, but you want content over here across the spectrum. If you don't have enough light, everything will be jammed to one side. So this is what you're looking for when you're finally dialing it in. In this case, Christine was using a tract, and it was open for 240 seconds, but it doesn't make a difference. The same thing when you're looking at single shot. You want to see that you have energy or you have light across the spectrum all the way to the right. Next. So the next thing I use, I'm going to talk about, well, I have my pictures, I'm satisfied, how do we edit them? And I'm going to walk through some Lightroom edits and talk about some of the tools I use. Now, I'm not going to use these tools in the purpose of the edits, but since I mentioned them, I want to put them up here and make them available. I use Adobe Camera Raw, and Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw are 98% identical. The reason I use Adobe Camera Raw, I want to manage my own images. Lightroom does a great job. It has its own catalogs. People feel strongly both ways. I like Adobe Camera Raw, then I use Photoshop. But obviously you can do this with Capture One or any other software that edits these. There's nothing special about it. It's just what I use, and you'll see these examples. I use Photoshop. Photoshop you don't need unless you really want to work with blending images, or you have a foreground you may have taken. Let's say you're in blue hour. It's 10 o'clock at night. It's the end of blue hour. You just have a little bit of light. You're taking the foreground of a building, and it's a totally different settings. It's a perfect foreground. And then you wait another 2 hours, eat something for dinner. You don't move your thing. That's the advantage of my glow sticks. No one touches your tripod, doesn't move your tripod. You go back, you change your settings to capture the Milky Way. The only real way to do the blending of those images is in Photoshop. I'm not going to touch on it here. I spent a lot of time with Photoshop. I enjoy Photoshop, which is weird, but that's how you do it. The next thing I use, it's not necessary, but I use Topaz AI for noise reduction. Even at 6400 ISO, you still have a lot of noise in that image. I like Topaz AI. It's easy to use. I'm very successful. If I'm doing stacked images, I use Starry Landscape Stacker. Once again, I take advantage of using usually about 20 light frames and 20 dark frames. Once again, the dark frames capture the noise of your camera, the noise in your sensor, which is a function typically of the thermal environment, how hot it is or cool it is outside, and removes that from the photos. When I work with panoramic photos, especially if I'm doing vertical panos, I use PT GUI to do the stitching. And finally, a very inexpensive but a very nice plugin, if you're using Photoshop, is an action called Mini Stars. It's $20. It reduces the star density. I'm not going to go into it in this discussion, but highly recommend it. Next. As we go through these examples, and I'll show you one of my images that I took in northern Arizona, the first thing you do is adjust the white balance. When I look at a lot of Milky Way photos online or posts in people's sites, you know, the sky is bright blue. The sky's not blue. You know, dark is dark, dark is black. Cheryl mentioned another, there's some people who are very dogmatic about this point. I'm not dogmatic. You know, there are people who are just like angry about it. I'm certainly not angry. I don't care that much. But when I show people how to do this, I just want to remind people, the sky is black. The absence of light is black. It's not blue. You adjust exposure, we'll talk about a little bit, and adjust contrast. And I'll walk through my procedure. To do this, the procedure I was taught, there's some basics, and of course, you can do beyond this. And I'll show you the examples. Next. The white balance, you want to remove the color cast. And you'll see in the example I'll show with the sliders, to find the color cast, the first thing you do is you take vibrance and saturation and you pull the sliders over to 100. And it looks crazy, but that's okay. But it emphasizes the color cast, allows you to remove it. The next thing you do, we'll walk through this together, is correct the blue and yellow slider. The warmth of the photo, the temperature. And this is where you're careful to make sure the Milky Way is not blue, and I'll show you examples. And finally, you correct between the green and the magenta slider. Next, I'm sorry. I just sort of assumed that. This is the starting raw image. In this case, I probably will close the lights in the back. That's okay. You got that, Rob? Thanks. This is the image. This is the Milky Way. This is the galactic core. This is taken, it's called Stony House. It is on the road from, what's it called? The Navajo Bridge that crosses the Colorado River in Arizona. This is just due north. And it's just sort of a nice image to capture the background. This is the starting point. I tend to start with, that's a linear profile. I can tell you about that if you ask me later. I want it as flat as possible. Next, please. The first thing I do is pull up the vibrance and the saturation to 100%. This is a weird looking image, but this allows me to look at the image and say, wow, there's too much of a blue color cast in the sky. It exaggerates the color cast that allows you to correct for the color cast. Next. Here, there was a very slight move. If you go back one, if you don't mind. Thanks. So here the temperature is 3550 Kelvin. And next, please, I go up to 44,000 Kelvin. So it's a relatively small adjustment. And suddenly, the color cast is gone. It's correct. Next. The next step, and these are very systematic, and I'm happy to share these. I have little cards. I didn't bring extras, but I'm happy to share them. I adjusted the exposure up, 0.15 stops. This is important. I brought the highlights all the way down. I bring the shadows up plus 40. And obviously, this depends on your image. This image lends itself to this. And I brought the blacks down. Most importantly, I took the vibrance and saturation back to 0. So you only push them up to get the color cast correct for the color cast, then you remove it. In this case, I played a little bit with the calibration. I brought up the red pixels and the blue primaries just to get a little more emphasis in the foreground. Oh, look, I have them all summarized here, all my adjustments. Next. Now, one of the nice features, and if I'm really spending a lot of time with Photoshop, I don't use it, but in Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw, dehaze, and I take it all the way up here to 69 to really emphasize that core. And that's found under the effects part of both Lightroom and Adobe Camera Raw. Next. In this case, I create a very simple mask just of the sky. And once again, I haven't left Lightroom. Here's my sky mask. And in my sky mask, I added a localized curve to get a little emphasis. Next. And this is the before shot, before treatment, here's after. Now, I would take this to Lightroom, and the final one I didn't bring with me or didn't add to the deck. In Lightroom, that's where I start doing the noise reduction, though I could do it, in Photoshop rather, that's where I do the noise reduction. That's where I remove the streaks, objects moving through the sky. That's where I run the mini stars action and do some other corrections of the foreground. But I wanted to give you a sense that just taking the raw Milky Way image to this point before you do a lot of other stuff doesn't take a whole lot of time. It's relatively straightforward with those simple steps. Next. These are my sources for learning Milky Way photography. I learned from Christine Richet, that's her website, her academy. Another great instructor, especially when it comes to light painting of the foregrounds, is Richard Tati. He's out of Australia, and he basically makes all his stuff available for free, or he'll give you his entire course. He said, please give a donation. So I gave him $20, which who knows what that is in Australian dollars, is probably about 40. Another wonderful instructor who unfortunately passed away at the age of 34 is Alan Wallace. He has wonderful books. He has wonderful YouTube. He's an extraordinary Milky Way photographer. I never had a chance to meet him. He died very young of, I think it was liver cancer, very sad. One of the places where I learned a great deal, and this conference occurs every year and a half. The last one was in September of last year at Kanab, Utah. It's the Nightscaper Conference. It's a 4-day conference. It's scheduled around the new moon. They have wonderful lectures, wonderful demonstrations, wonderful instruction. And then each night, people go to different locations. Kanab was great because there are lots of places to go in that part of southern Utah, and I highly recommend it. The next one is coming up, I think, about a year from now. It's going to be in March, so it was 18 months from the previous one. And finally, there are many workshops. Cheryl was telling me before the meeting, she participated in some. I'm going on the workshop a week after next. The only little bit cautionary, some instructors, whether you pay for their courses or in Utah in the workshops, you want to make sure if you're just starting Milky Way photography, that they're not, some of these instructors, the one I'm going to, Joshua Snow, great guy, great young man, he assumes you have some deep expertise in Photoshop. He assumes that I'll do luminosity masks and these separations. It's great if you do, but I would just recommend watching their free videos on YouTube, see how they do their editing. Otherwise, it becomes kind of overwhelming depending on the tools they're using, or it might be a perfect match. But I think that is it, and I'm happy to take any questions. And that's one of Richard Tati's photographs. He does some beautiful farm equipment. This is in Australia. And this would be what the Milky Way, I mentioned the vertical, in October on the Northern Hemisphere. That's what it looks like. And that's all I have. So, any questions?
Yeah. Any questions?
Sure.
Are there any tricks to bringing out the different colors within the book?
Yeah.
And the
Yeah, that's usually done in Photoshop.
Okay.
Yeah, The Milky, even star trails are way more colorful. I just didn't go into it here. I can point you to a couple sources, but yes, you can do, like in Photoshop, you do traditional color separation I typically use a point color tool to do it initially. You can play a little bit with calibration sliders, but it's relatively easy to do. And if someone's really interested, I'll send you one of my raw images. So it's easy to work with someone's raw image and try to do it. Happy to share one. Just let me know and you can just play with it. Okay, thanks. Of course. Yes?
The moon can give you really nice foreground lighting.
It can, yeah.
Which phase of the moon would you go for that would maybe have a sliver that sets just before astronomical dark?
That's a great point. You can get beautiful foreground lighting from the moon, but part of it is not necessarily the phase of the moon, because it's going to be a relatively new moon. It's the relative position of the moon relative to the Milky Way. So that's why I like photopills. If the moon is where the Milky Way is, you're not going to win. If the moon is behind you and illuminating the foreground, or in certain cases, the stars, especially with water, will give you beautiful illumination. It's great. But that's the sort of planning that I really recommend the PhotoPills app to figure it out. Sure, they're gorgeous pictures with the moon, but the moon just can't be where the Milky Way is at the time.
Okay, what else?
It'll take me a while to pack up, so if any other questions, just talk to me after. Cool.
If we have no other questions, I will say good evening for the night, and we will see you guys next week for our photo contest, digital contest with the theme of landscapes, and we will see you next week. Good night.
Right.
Anyone who hasn't been with us, we as a club have gone to Spruce Knob Lake a few times, which is another of the lower light areas, and we don't have anything planned this year, but about every other year we tend to do field trips there, always at a new moon. But it's rough camping. So that's made some people not want to come.
Yeah.
It's a lot of fun whenever we do go.